With over 70% of Romanians believing the EU is too intrusive, how can a new pro-European president change the narrative and bring real stability? After a historically cancelled presidential election in November 2024, Romanians' trust in their political class collapsed even more. But then, a man who had never belonged to the traditional halls of power emerged from this chaos. A math genius turned activist now sits in the nation's highest office. Can he really hold the center of a fractured Europe? Nicușor Dan didn't grow up dreaming of power. In fact, he was far from politics for most of his early life. Born on December 20th, 1969 in Făgăraș, a small town in central Romania, Dan was known early on for his astonishing brilliance in mathematics. By age 18, he had won gold medals at the International Mathematical Olympiad in 1986 and 1987, automatically placing him on the radar of academic elites. He would go on to study at the University of Bucharest before securing a place at École Normale Supérieure in Paris, one of the most prestigious universities in France. There he completed his PhD in mathematics while quietly building a career path most assumed would lead to academia, not politics. But what pulled him back to Romania wasn't ambition, it was destruction. In the mid-2000s, Dan returned to Bucharest and was disturbed by the rapid erasure of the city's historic buildings. Dozens of architectural heritage sites were being bulldozed for commercial gain. Shocked by the government's silence and complicity, Dan stepped out of the world of numbers into the mess of civil resistance. In 2006, he founded the Uniunea Salvați Bucureștiul, translated as Save Bucharest Union, a civic initiative aimed at preserving architectural integrity and combating real estate corruption. The movement gained traction not because it was well publicized, but because it was determined. By 2015, after nearly a decade of local activism, the union evolved into the Uniunea Salvați Romania, a pro-European anti-corruption political party that offered a direct challenge to Romania's worn-out establishment. The USR was unlike any other party in Romania at the time because it had no oligarch backers, no media empire behind it, and no deep party machinery. What it had instead was legitimacy. And by 2016, the party made a stunning entry into parliament, winning a record 30 seats, mostly from urban and younger voters who were fed up with Romania's legacy parties. However, the deeper Dan entered the party structure, the more friction he encountered. Tensions grew between the party's progressive wing and its more conservative members. Internal debates rose over LGBTQ rights, European federalism, and the balance between economic reform and social policy. In 2017, while unable to reconcile his vision with the party's evolving direction, Dan stepped down as USR president. In 2020, Dan ran for the most powerful local office in the country, the Mayor of Bucharest. He won that election against all odds despite not being backed by either of the major parties. It was a dramatic victory in a city that had long been a stronghold of political insiders. Dan focused on infrastructure maintenance, budget transparency, and reducing municipal waste. For many, this boring governance style was what they craved after years of corruption, scandals, and theatrics. Dan's personality only deepened the contrast. He lived in a 3-room rented apartment, didn't own a private car, and often walked or used public transport to work. His image wasn't that of a political star, but of a technician called in to fix a broken system. When the 2025 elections were announced after the 2024 vote was annulled, many didn't see Dan as a frontrunner. He wasn't part of any coalition, didn't promise sweeping populist policies, and refused to attack rivals personally. Yet when the dust settled from the chaotic first round, he had emerged as a contender in the runoff, finishing just behind George Simeon. What made people trust him? It could be that he never really tried to sell anything. His modesty, intellectual discipline, and civic activism reminded Romanians of what politics could be, instead of what it had become. Dan didn't smile much, and he didn't steal either. And in this year, that seemed like a revolutionary act. So how exactly did he emerge as the winner of the Romanian presidential election? To understand why Nicușor Dan became president, you must first understand how the entire political class around him fell apart. Romania wasn't always this volatile. For much of the 2000s and 2010s, a tug-of-war between the Social Democratic Party and centre-right factions like the National Liberal Party dominated Romanian politics. However, trust was eroding under the surface as repeated corruption scandals, poor public services, and the emigration of over 3.4 million Romanians since 2007 left the country hollowed out from within. By 2023, public confidence in the political institution had dropped significantly, as most Romanians say they trust the EU rather than their own government, according to the Eurobarometer. Then came the 2024 presidential election, which was initially hailed as a routine democratic process, but quickly developed into chaos. The declared winner, Călin Georgescu, widely believed to have been supported by pro-Russian interests, was later disqualified due to several procedural irregularities. Behind closed door, the Romanian secret services reported that Russian bots and disinformation had played a significant role in swaying social media narratives to their advantage. This prompted the Constitutional Court to step in and annul the election results, marking the first time since the fall of communism that a presidential election result had been overturned. In February this year, President Klaus Iohannis, who was already facing impeachment pressure, announced his resignation. His early exit temporarily left the president in the hands of Ilie Bolyzan, the then Senate president. But Bolyzan's tenure was seen as transitional, meaning it was powerless to set a new agenda and unable to command any political authority. As EU representatives expressed concern, Romania's international credibility faltered during this short period. On the domestic front, the effects were even worse. Voters were outraged, and protesters began to fill the streets of cities such as Cluj-Napoca, Timișoara, and Constanța, waving Romanian and EU flags demanding electoral justice. Many who had already lost faith in the country's democracy now saw their worst fears confirmed, that even their votes could be erased. Amid this void stepped in two radically different forces. On one side was George Simeon, the charismatic leader of the far-right party, Alliance for the Union of Romanians. Simeon was seen as a loud patriot who promised to return to Romanian sovereignty. On the other side stood Nicușor Dan, who only released PDFs with detailed plans, budget breakdowns, and policy frameworks he intended to implement. In a country driven by fear and emotion, Dan offered something else. The runoff election was seen as a political contest and a referendum on what Romania wanted to become. Would it move closer to Hungary and Slovakia's populist models, or stay tied to the European Union, NATO, and the liberal democratic framework? Dan and Simeon were both symbols of two separate ideologies, and when the final vote came in, Romania made its choice. However, was it enough to restore what had already been broken? The second round of Romania's 2025 presidential election was not just a political rematch, but a moment of reckoning for an entire nation. After a first round that splintered votes across more than 10 candidates, the runoff narrowed the race to two strikingly different contenders, the far-right firebrand George Simeon and the quiet reformer Nicușor Dan. The result of this election became one of the most polarizing elections Romania had seen since the fall of communism in 1989. But even more than that, it became a defining moment for where Romania would stand within the European project. As the Alliance for the Union of Romanians leader, George Simeon seems to have tapped into years of frustration, regional equality, and the seemingly growing distrust in the Western-style liberal democracy practiced in Romania. Simeon, born in Făcșani in 1986, built his brand through street action and nationalist slogans. He also positioned himself as a protector for traditional Romanian identity, warning voters that their values, religion, and sovereignty were being washed away by too much involvement with Brussels. Under Simeon's leadership, AUR gained popularity by focusing on regions the central government had long overlooked. In rural areas such as the Oltenia region and parts of the Carpathian countryside, Simeon found audiences eager for change. Many of these areas still struggle with unemployment above 20%, underfunded schools, deteriorating infrastructure, and hospitals that lack basic equipment. The promise of integration with the EU had arrived late and was delivered slowly in these parts of the country, and for these voters, Simeon's campaign message felt like a long overdue response. Simeon's campaign emphasized sovereignty first. He blamed the EU for interfering in Romania's domestic law, undermining its traditions and pushing liberal policies that didn't sit well with the conservative Orthodox communities. His rallies were often characterized by chants against what he called the Brussels elite, attacks on immigration policies, and open criticism of LGBTQ rights legislation that had been gaining traction across the EU in recent years. On the other hand, Nicușor Dan offered a very different vision. His campaign focused on building credibility in institutions, fiscal discipline, and aligning Romanian law and governance with EU expectations. While Simeon spoke to the hearts, Dan spoke to the minds of Romanians and avoided heated debates and populist soundbites. His campaign message majored on rebuilding trust in democracy, stabilizing Romania's relationship with Brussels, and restoring international confidence after the turmoil of the 2024 election annulment. The division between the two men was more than ideological, it was generational, geographic, and psychological. Urban voters in Bucharest, Cluj-Napoca, Timișoara, and Iași tended to lean toward Dan because these cities had higher access to EU funds, more job opportunities, and greater cultural exposure. Many younger and university-educated people saw Simeon threatening democratic norms and international alliances. Meanwhile, older voters and those in economical, isolated towns often saw Dan as part of the elite they no longer trusted. The runoff election, which was held on May 18, 2025, saw a turnout rate of 39.8%, making it one of its lowest in Romania's modern history. Many voters simply felt disillusioned, while others feared what would happen no matter who won. But the outcome was indeed razor-thin. According to the Romanian Central Electoral Bureau, Nicușor Dan secured 53.6% of the vote, narrowly defeating Simeon, who captured 46.4%. However, for Brussels, the result came as a relief, but the close margin made one thing clear: Romania's democracy is no longer invincible. The far right is no longer just a fringe, but a growing power, and had just a few thousand voters made different choices, the future of Romania's position in the EU could have taken a far more uncertain turn. But amidst all these, what does the future hold for Romania's new president in the EU? As president, Nicușor Dan would be inheriting not just a fragile democracy, but a country sitting as one of the EU's most critical geopolitical fault lines. With the war in Ukraine continuing to destabilize the East and Russia's influence seeping into regional politics, Romania's strategic importance has never been greater in times like these. Dan's victory did not just come as a domestic reform, it would indeed have profound implications for the EU, NATO, and the broader Euro-Atlantic alliance. From the early days of his campaign, Dan made his stance on global alliances unambiguous. Romania belongs to the West. He has shown this by his repeated declaration of support for NATO, while also emphasizing that Romania's security cannot be compromised by nationalist sentiment or budget shortfalls. Under his leadership, Romania plans to gradually raise its defense spending to above 3% of GDP by 2030, exceeding the NATO minimum requirement of 2%. This move is not just symbolic, it signals to both allies and adversaries that Romania intends to pull its weight when the alliance is under pressure from Russian aggression and American electoral unpredictability. Beyond numbers, Dan is focused on substance and has plans for Romania to begin upgrading its air defense systems, modernizing its military logistics infrastructure, and investing in cyber defense. One of this plan's key pillars includes ramping domestic arms production to reduce reliance on foreign suppliers, a strategy that aligns well with the EU's push for defense self-sufficiency. On the European Union front, Dan has also spoken about a sharp, coherent reform agenda. He believes the EU must be more than just a market. It must function as a political union with teeth, including more transparent governance, democratic oversight, and firm enforcement of rule of law standards across member states. Dan's call for stronger institutions across Europe comes when Hungary, Slovakia, and even Italy are challenging the very principles of EU unity. While he supports EU expansion, he believes future members must meet strict standards before joining. Dan has also taken a clear stance on the Ukraine conflict. He has advocated for continued military and humanitarian support for Kiev and tougher sanctions against Russian financial institutions operating in the Balkans. Nowhere would Dan's foreign policy vision be more deeply felt than in his approach to neighboring Moldova. The small neighbour to the east has long been caught in a tug-of-war between Europe and Russia, and Dan might likely make Moldova's EU path a national priority. Under Dan's leadership, Romania is expected to advocate for pre-accession funding through Brussels, ensuring that Moldova doesn't fall through the cracks of geopolitics. By calculation, if Moldova is successfully integrated into the EU, it will automatically create a secure buffer zone between Romania and an increasingly unpredictable Ukraine-Russia front. More importantly, it will signal to countries such as Georgia and the Western Balkans that alignment with Brussels yields real partnerships. Dan's foreign policy model will likely focus on methodical, rule-based engagement and ultimately be a reliable EU partner. When the final votes were counted on the night of May 18, 2025, and Nicușor Dan was officially declared Romania's new president, the response in Brussels was a careful relief. There were no fireworks displays in Berlin and no declarations from Washington having called it a turning point. Dan's win was received as a small but meaningful victory for liberal democracy at a time when authoritarian pressure continued to rise across most of Europe. Romania has been a growing concern for the EU over the past decade, not because of its size, but because of its position. Sitting on the EU's eastern edge with a population of 18.9 million citizens, it's the sixth most populous EU member state, sharing a 650-kilometre border with Ukraine. Just across the Black Sea from Crimea, Romania has become a frontline state in both security and ideological terms. Whatever happens in Bucharest will send ripples across Brussels, Warsaw and Vienna, and for months the possibility of a George Simeon presidency created discomfort in many of these capitals. Simeon's open criticism of the EU, his pro-nationalist rhetoric, and his refusal to engage with multilateral frameworks made many European leaders fear a new Hungary-style friction within the bloc. EU officials were already dealing with Viktor Orban's obstructionism and Poland's judicial reforms before the recent political reset in 2023, and Slovakia's wavering foreign policy. So the thought of another far-right voice gaining a presidential seat, especially one so close to conflict zones and energy corridors, raised quiet alarm. Dan's narrow victory in the election was taken as a sign that moderate and pro-European leadership still had a pulse in the region. In Brussels, European Council President Charles Michel released a brief statement welcoming Romania's democratic stability. At the same time, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, highlighted the importance of continued cooperation on shared values and goals. The truth is, Europe sees Dan as a calculated bet, not a guaranteed solution. Unlike other pro-European leaders like Emmanuel Macron or Mark Rutte, Dan entered the European stage without many strong alliances in the power corridors of the West. He is respected, yes, but largely unknown beyond Central and Eastern European circles. His calm and evidence-based communication style doesn't easily break into the media narratives that seem to be dominated by larger, louder personalities. Nevertheless, it is exactly that demeanour of low drama and high discipline that some EU insiders quietly hope will bring a new tone to the bloc. Romania's strategic importance is rising fast, and with Sweden and Finland joining NATO alongside the war in Ukraine grinding on with no end in sight, the Black Sea region is now one of the most militarized zones in Europe. Romania hosts the United States forces at Mihail Kogani-Chanu Air Base, plays a role in NATO's southern eastern defense posture, and is increasingly relied upon to secure energy transit routes, particularly as Europe tries to move away from Russian gas. For the EU, having a president in Romania committed to regional stability, multilateralism and rule of law cooperation means more than it did a decade ago. It means safety. Yet the question is, how much can one president really do? Romania's semi-presidential political system means that the president can shape foreign policy, oversee intelligence services, block or refer legislation, but cannot pass laws or control the budget fully. Much depends on who controls the parliament and who serves as the country's prime minister. As of Dan's election, the parliament remains divided, with no single party holding a majority and multiple coalitions shifting alliances now and then. Dan's power will rely heavily on his ability to build consensus, but there is also no guarantee. This limits what Dan can achieve alone, especially on regional-wide issues such as treaty reforms, sanctions policy, or financial integration. Still, his presence in the European Council means his vote counts on major decisions, and even symbolically, Romania now sends a different signal. It no longer leans towards isolationism, not seeking to weaponize identity politics. Instead, it is returning to the table with a leader whose message is clear: stability first, then change. Perhaps the biggest impact Dan may have is not on Brussels, but in cities like Sofia, Ljubljana, Chisinau, and Skopje, where his win shows that it's still possible for reform-minded EU-aligned candidates to succeed in countries where populism has been growing. For Moldova, which looks to Romania as political and cultural sibling, Dan's election is especially powerful as it mirrors what is possible. For Bulgaria, which is still battling systemic corruption and instability, it gives hope that EU values can return to the center of public discourse. Even in Western Balkan states, Dan's success may inspire young reformers who feel boxed out by oligarch-controlled political systems. However, the road ahead is long, and Europe's history has no shortage of promising leaders who were swallowed by inertia or structural limitations. Dan's presidency will be tested not just by foreign threats or economic headwinds, but also by the slow grind of expectation. Would he be able to sustain faith without spectacle? Can he rally public support without grand gestures? With limited tools, can he keep Romania anchored to Europe and keep Europe paying attention? For now, the world is watching quietly and hopefully. In a time when Europe's foundations feel uncertain and old alliances are being tested, Romania's quiet turn towards reform may matter more than the headlines suggest. Nicușor Dan didn't win with slogans or spectacle, but with something rarer: credibility. His presidency may not reshape Europe overnight, but even a steady hand can shift the balance in a continent drifting between extremes. What is your stand on Romania's new presidency? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button, share and subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you in the next video.